Hey, thanks, Jess, and thanks everyone for sitting in today. We're going to talk about spring and summer avalanches, or at least that was the topic, but we're already into May, so we're into late spring. So we're going to use that, we'll keep that time frame in mind as we talk about this. And I want to talk about avalanches in terms of how we as mountain rescuers, what we need to think about, consider when we're making decisions is from a strategic standpoint, certainly as we're running an operation, as well as when we're out on the hill, what are we going to do tactically? To get started in the program, don't do this though. Please don't be these guys. I know as we're moving into summer and couloirs and we like to climb or we're out rescuing people, stay out of these sort of gullies. They make for easy travel, but there's a reason those gullies are there, and it's like a bowling lane and not a good place to be. As we talk about wet snow avalanches and the problem, we're going to put this presentation into two different parts. We'll talk about wet snow and avalanches, and then we'll bring it together. When we're talking about wet snow avalanches, I think a lot of us have experience with dry snow avalanches as well, and I want to do a little bit of a contrast or a comparison here. So we'll step outside the box, so to speak, and if we think of avalanches in terms of animals, which animal would you think of best typifies wet snow avalanches and dry snow avalanches? Is it the rattlesnake, or is it the Africanized honeybees? And I'll let you just think about that for a moment. Which avalanche represents which critter, or which critter represents which avalanche? And the reason I do this is because they are very distinct. Dry snow avalanches are very much like the rattlesnake. Rattlesnakes, yes, they're vicious, but they want to be left alone. They're fairly solitary, and we have to provoke them to get into trouble. And as we should know with dry snow avalanches, more than 90% of the avalanche victims that get killed in dry snow avalanches triggered their own avalanche, or somebody else, usually a member of their party, triggered the avalanche. Wet snow avalanches are like the really angry Africanized honeybees. They're easy to make mad, and then they just keep coming. They come in swarms, and they're just nasty with it. But a lot of people will tend to think of dry snow avalanches as being the big problem. And for mountain rescue, wet snow avalanches can be a very serious problem for us. Just a very simple look at things here. Maybe if you kind of forget about everything else that I talk about today, here's just a few points to be aware of. When we have wind, when we have thick cloud cover, when the snowpack is draining water, we're seeing the streams are rising. There's the snow surface almost looks corduroy-like. That's the water draining out. This is a time when we see fewer wet avalanches. When we see more wet avalanches is when we see the average temperature staying above 32 degrees for at least a couple of days, maybe 3 days. And this is really that first initial big warm-up when temperatures stay above freezing for 32. After it's done that for a week or two, the water drains down and it's not a problem. But we see more wet snow avalanches when we have several hours of direct sunshine, a lot of heat being added to the snow. It's melting quickly. And I call it greenhousing, where we've got thin clouds. And I think you know those days when it's just thin clouds and it's just really warm, and that's the solar radiation being reflected back off the clouds and back down to the snow surface. And when we see water pooling on crust or in facet layers, I say pooling, but it's also that the layer can be saturated. In a faceted layer, facets are the sugar snow. They're small grains, sharp sides, corners and multiple layers to them, and I'll show you that in a moment. But when it's been real warm for a couple of days, it's the first big warm-up of the season, lots of bright sunshine, or there's just thin, hazy clouds and it feels real warm, and the snow's getting wet, slushy, that's when we're going to see wet avalanches happen. Start putting the avalanche problem into perspective. If we look at all accidents, and this was from 1990 to a couple of years ago, we can see that almost all of the fatalities happened in dry snow. Only 6% happened during wet snow. But when we look at the trigger, you'll see that the dry snow were human triggered. We triggered our own avalanche, or somebody in the group did 95% of the time. But with wet snow, only about 1 in 3. So yeah, certainly education and knowledge and training is really important to stay out of dry snow avalanches and periods of instability. The problem with 1 in 3 being human triggered for wet snow avalanches is that means that 70% of the avalanches are natural releases. It means we didn't provoke them. They came down on top of people. And that's why it makes them like the Africanized honeybees. And when we look at these, oh, this duplicated, sorry about that. Well, I think you got the message there, that most wet snow avalanche accidents are natural releases. When we look at the time period, and I'm doing late spring, so May through August, some people will say summer goes through September, but really not for avalanches. But May and June are the big months, so we're coming into those seasons right now when things are happening. Where are these accidents happening? Alaska and Washington. I mean, that makes sense. Those have the biggest glaciated peaks where there's snow in the summertime, and we see those accidents. But even Colorado, Oregon, and you can see the other states. And this is over a big period, I mean 65 years. We're only looking at 117 fatalities. So it's not many, it's only a couple of fatalities a season, but they do happen. And when we look at when they happen by decade, kind of the worst of it peaked in the 1980s. But a big spike in the number killed, that was due to a bad accident on Mount Rainier that killed 11 climbers. But as we look at this, what I find interesting is that from the 80s, the number of accidents and killed started decreasing, but it's come back up in the last 5 or 6 years. And I think that reflects more people out there and probably more people having some bad luck. So who gets into trouble? Well, certainly it's climbers, and I mean they lead by a huge margin. Just a few skiers and fewer hikers, and then there's some other activities there. And yes, a sea kayaker, and that's probably the most unique and most unlucky of all avalanche victims. But that was a sea kayaker in Alaska paddling at the bottom of a couloir when the snow from up above. But if we look at this category, these are very different than the accident victims that we see in the wintertime with dry snow avalanches, when generally snowmobilers and skiers are the predominant victims. Just a quick look at Colorado here from over the years. There's a definite time pattern to the type of avalanches. Hard slab and soft slab avalanches, the HS and SS, those are dry snow avalanches, and we see those happening, those accidents happening in April. I mean, there's certainly accidents that have happened in March, but not from a springtime perspective. But boy, here in Colorado, once we get into May, we start seeing the wet snow and we start seeing the wet slabs and wet loose accidents happening. So here's just an example of a wet snow avalanche. This was in France from a few years ago at Saint-François-Longchamps during a big warm-up that actually happened in February. So it wasn't classic springtime, but it was spring conditions. As you look at this avalanche, you can see that it runs very slowly compared to a dry snow avalanche, but with tremendous amounts of force, just because of the sheer mass of it. Wet snow avalanches tend not to bury people as often as dry snow avalanches, but they're very destructive forces of nature. And you can see it coming down here. And actually, they got everybody off the lift. Nobody was injured in that incident. So let's kind of jump into the talk here and talk about wet snow and avalanches. As you look at this picture, one thing about the debris, this is wet snow debris, and it's all kind of balled up like snowballs, and that's a sure sign of wet avalanches. We've got our classic snow crystal here, the six-sided snow crystal, but it undergoes change once it's on the ground. And I want to do just a quick refresher on snow grains and how they change and what that means, because that is important when it comes to wet snow avalanches. So fresh snow, classic snow crystal right there. When it's been on the ground for a while, snow, it's a really complex shape with surface area to volume, and it wants to simplify. And the most simple shape is a sphere. So when the snow is deep, temperatures are mild and warm, the snow grains actually start to round out. But they don't become weaker. They get rounder, but as they get rounder, they pack together, and you can see necks that form between the grains. And so this snow becomes very strong, and this is what we call sintered snow. It's strong. Happens when the snowpack is deep, generally more than a meter of snow on the ground. Temperatures are warmer, and we end up with a strong snowpack. Doesn't mean that it's unstable or stable, but just that snow is strong. When the snowpack is shallow, temperatures are cold, and what we see commonly here in Colorado and across the Rockies is faceting. In the snow crystals, they start getting straight sides, sharp angles, and they'll even get the multiple layers, the facets. These snow grains become very weak, and this is fragile. This is what we call sugar snow. So we have our rounded snow, sintering snow, and with faceted snow here. This is the dry snow. But as we get into spring conditions, when thaw starts to happen, the snow is melting, it's refreezing. It's freeze-thaw, freeze-thaw, this melt-freeze metamorphism. The snow can be weak when it's wet, and here what we're looking at, the larger clumps are the ice grains with water frozen in between. And when it's wet, liquid, it's weak. But when it's refrozen, it's strong. So there's definitely a time period to strong snow and weak snow. But the bottom line is wet snow equals weak snow. Well, how wet is wet? If we start with dry snow and it's just starting to get sticky, it makes a really, it's just starting to stick together, it's starting to make a good snowball, that's moist. And if we look at terms of snow strength, as we go across this from moist to wet to very wet to slush, you'll see the strength actually increases, but right between about 7% and 8% liquid water content, there's a big loss in the strength of the snow. So when we can make a really good snowball, there's good strength, but as soon as we can start squeezing water out of the snow as we're making that snowball, we can drip it out, the snow has lost a lot of strength. And then certainly it becomes slush or like a Slurpee, but that's only at about 15% water content, so it's still mostly ice. So what contributes to the wet snow? Now there's a number of things from temperature and time of day and elevation aspect, solar radiation, rain. These are the sort of things that are happening around us or into the terrain that we're venturing into. So we need to pay attention to these 7 factors. And basically, how do we figure out, or how do we know it's wet? Well, we can see it, we can squeeze it, we can hear it, or we sink into it. So as we're out traveling in the snow, we're looking at it, we're feeling it, we're hearing it. But the big one is how far are we sinking into this snow? With this picture, as you look at it, these are the drainage channels, the percolation channels that you'll see in old snow where the water is draining down through. And when we see this, it's a sign of very strong, stable snow, because that water is moving through. It's not pooling. So let's go back to the sinking in it. And we'll use the red, yellow, green light, the stoplight metaphor as we evaluate things. As you can see, when you're walking, if you're staying on top, you're sinking to your ankles, maybe a little deeper, or all the way to your knees. What does this mean? So here's a picture of sinking in, and I think many of you have experienced, you're out early in the morning, the snow surface is frozen, it's easy to walk, travel across, but at some point, quickly start breaking through. And how far we break through really tells us about the strength or the lack of strength. And here he's laughing, but that's only because he's on a shallow slope. So when we can stay on top, it's a green light, but I have a yellow one here because we still need to know what's going on underneath. Remember, to have an avalanche, a slab avalanche, we need to have a slab, a cohesive layer on top with a weak layer below it. And a weak layer is just something that's softer than a layer above it. So we need a slab, we need a weak layer, we need a steep slope, and we need a trigger. So just because it's strong on the surface, we've also got to consider what's going on beneath it, and also what is the trend. Is it morning and starting to warm up, or now is it late afternoon or evening and temperatures starting to cool down? So green light, so we can stay on top, go most everywhere. As soon as we start sinking to our ankles, it's a bit of a warning sign. What's the transition? Is it going to continue to warm up, or are things cooling off? If it's going to continue to warm up, we may want to change aspects or the slopes that we're on, or we might even start thinking about heading home. When we can sink into our calves, the snow's less strong, so it's definitely a yellow light. But what's the trend? Again, warming up, that may turn us into a red light. And really at this point, this is the time to start getting off of the snow and out from underneath these steeper slopes. When we start sinking into our knees or deeper into wet snow, that's red light just all the way around. And when we're sinking in that deep, it's time to get off those slopes and out from underneath the steeper slopes, especially if it's newer snow. And when I say newer snow, snow that's fallen in the past 2, 3 days. Once we get out about 5 days, water starts draining through and it's much harder to get wet snow avalanches. So just a quick reminder here. It's all about how far we're sinking in and what is going to be the trend over the course of the day or the course of the morning or afternoon. You know, often we get called late morning. By the time we respond, it's now early to mid-afternoon, and that window of stable snow has shrunk to we're often having to deal with fairly wet snow. A word about crust. As we look at this picture, it's a little bit fuzzy, but this is Fernspiegel. It's the snow mirror, snow window, and it's just when a nice icy, thin icy crust forms right on the snow surface. I'm going to show you an example of some wet snow instability taken by a friend of mine, Ron Johnson.
water. A couple drainages over a wet slide release on another steep east or south-facing slope. Isolated down the snow, 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. Compression tap test 3, shear quality 1 is popped right out. This is a low-angled slope, and it's just really wet, large-grained faceted crystals. And that's the weak area we're worried about with these wet slabs that may happen once this crust gets melted.
So the point from Ron's little video here, as we watched it, is we had a pretty significant, or he had a pretty significant ice crust, 5 inches thick there. And that would easily support your weight for hiking around, even on crampons, skis, no problem at all. But when it comes to avalanches, we've got to be thinking what's underneath the slab, what's underneath a crust. So we've got to look for that, and underneath it was wet, saturated snow. So it was a potentially very dangerous situation. But if we only thought of it as a hard frozen ice crust, that's what can get people into trouble. As we look at the avalanches and the cause of avalanches, with dry snow, the avalanche problem is that of simply overloading the strength. We've added too much load to the snowpack. It just can't hold it in place. But when we're dealing with wet snow, it's actually a loss of strength. We're reducing the strength of snow because the thaw conditions, whether it's thaw or maybe even rain, that's melting the bonds that made the snow strong. So wet snow is a reduction in strength. Dry snow is just overloading the strength of the snow. A typical spring avalanche cycle, we have fresh new snow. The sun's on it, we start to see the roller balls or pinwheels, sometimes even shallow snow avalanches. And these are just a good kind of precursor that the snow surface has lost strength. And here we can see a bunch of people kind of quasi-glissading, sliding, tumbling down. And I think many of you have probably experienced where you're starting to glissade, and as you're sliding down, the snow just keeps billowing up, piling up between your legs and then around you. And all of a sudden, you're trapped in the snow and moving down. And that gets a number of climbers every year. But when to really watch out for this is when we're dealing with fresh snow that's a couple of days old, maybe 3 days old. Another typical example is when we've got either bright sunshine or maybe rain. The water percolates down through the snowpack, but then it hits a hard crust, seen here in blue, where then it melts the bonds between the snow above and the crust. It lubricates it, and we see the wet slides releasing. These wet slides are going to release somewhere in the middle of the pack. And this is an example of that water as it drains down through the snowpack, just spraying blue dye onto the surface. And you can see how it drains down, but more importantly, it starts to pool or collect on harder surfaces or crust. Another example is the deep wet slabs that we see a little later in the spring, or certainly during periods of significant warm-up. And now that liquid water is going all the way down to the ground, where it's running maybe on rocky slabs or onto frozen tundra, or just the ground gets wet and there's a complete loss of strength. Now we see the whole snowpack releasing as a unit. Sorry about that. And one thing about temperatures, I think anytime you hear the weather service or the weather forecast talking about record temperatures, that's when we're going to see lots of wet activity in the mountains. Sorry about that. Now I think I have my voice back. So, pay attention to those forecasts for big warm-ups, because that also translates to the wet slides in the mountains. Here's an example of a bunch of roller balls, pinwheels. These are wet, loose snow releases that came off of the mountains. From a distance, they look pretty small because they're not that big, massive slab. But when you get up close to these things, you often find the debris is 3 or 4 feet deep. These, what we think are little slides, are 100 feet across. So they're certainly big enough to really hurt somebody. Wet snow releases, like the bumblebees, they tend to come in swarms. Here's another example, looking up. In this one, the wet snow releases, the loose ones, started from the rocky cliffs up above, came down into the upper basin, kind of funnel shape, and triggered more wet snow and maybe even some slab, and it ran down through the gully. Another wet release here, but this one, the backstory on this is a west aspect that in this avalanche is occurring about 6 o'clock in the evening. So it's just taken that long for the sun to get around onto the mountain to warm the snow and get the water running. This is all snow on a rocky slab. So wet releases can often happen later in the day or even into the evening hours. Here's an example, or this is an actual avalanche from an accident that happened here in Colorado on one of our high 14ers. And a couple of things are noteworthy about this. One is it looks really big, and it was massive by the time it got to the bottom, several thousand vertical feet. You can see there's a bunch of dirty snow in it, and this was not from dust that blew in, but this is from the wet snow and training dirt and ground as it moved down and pulled that into the snow. What's interesting with this one is this happened to a couple of climbers on one of our 14ers. As they started down, they were well above 13,000 feet. The snow was still hard. They thought they would glissade down. They glissaded several hundred vertical feet. They had a nice time. The snow started getting wet. And first one starts down, the second one starts down, they get a little further, and then the snow starts piling up between their legs, breaks out a little bit more around them, starts out very small, 10, 15 feet across, but it just got larger and larger as it went down, and it carried them down as well into something that ran a couple of thousand vertical feet and over 150 feet across. So what can be a very small avalanche at the start can get really big in a hurry. This is another human-triggered avalanche here in Colorado from a couple of springs ago. This ran almost a mile, and it's one of the problems with any avalanche, wet or dry, is that once they release, we really have no idea how big they're going to be. But in the springtime, they can just keep getting bigger and bigger as they plow into wetter and weaker snow. I think if anything, from a rescuer standpoint, the good news is that people are less likely to get buried in wet snow releases. The bad news is if they are buried, they can be really difficult to locate and access. Here we have a loose snow avalanche, that inverted V, upside down V, started from a single point, snow spilling off the rocks, but as it ran down, it then triggered a wet slab avalanche. So if you remember those factors I talked about that affect where avalanches happen and when they happen with wet snow, if we think of this as kind of like a compass rose, let's call it an aspect rose. We've got the different sides of the mountain, the different rings or bands represent different elevations. Let's think about when and where wet snow avalanches are going to happen. Where are they going to happen first? Well, they're going to start to happen first on those southerly warmer aspects at lower elevations. And then as temperatures warm up higher on the mountain, we're going to start to see them maybe on the west aspects and east aspects at those middle elevations. And as it continues to warm, now the northerly aspects, at least at the lower elevations, are going to start to become active. And as temperatures continue to warm, eventually even the high elevation north aspects start to produce avalanches. So this can be a really good indicator for us is that when we're starting to see wet snow avalanches happen on south and east westerly facing slopes, and we know that it's going to be warm over the next couple of days, we can start planning on seeing wet snow avalanches happening on other aspects and higher up the mountain as the time goes on. So to put this into practice, let's look at an example here. Got our snow border. This is wet, sloppy snow. Comes in here, ooh, shallow snow. He just collapses a bit of snow. So we have a small wet slab avalanche, but even look at the snow back behind him that's releasing. Well, he's okay, he's probably a bit nervous, but what's his buddy going to do? Being like a good buddy, gonna come down to see what's going on. It's probably really the last thing you should be doing. This fellow, he starts skiing down. We'll see here. He falls because that snow collapsed. It's heavy, it's trapped into it, and now it has him. And he's over some rocks in the Krumholtz and into what looks like a terrain trap. I guess the good news, he pops up here. And probably the only real damage is to his pride and soiled shorts. But very fine margin between well, I should say really luck that got him out of trouble. As we go into springtime, at least earlier in the spring, it's really important to know the avalanche forecast. So use the forecast that comes from your local avalanche center, if you have one in your area. If you're not, you're going to have to rely more on the weather. But these avalanche forecast centers, they do a great job in their bulletins of telling you what's going on. I think as you look at this one, this was from March, the end of March a year ago, this would be this is a classic spring pattern in the terms of the danger. Moderate danger at the low and middle elevations on the mountain, but low danger up high. Temperatures are still cool or have been cool. When we're out there, ideally we've got an avalanche forecast in our hip pocket to help keep us informed of what's going on and more importantly what to expect when we're out there. But man, we've got to really keep our eyes open to a whole lot of stuff, and there's a lot of it. Sorry for the busyness of this slide, but dealing with snow, wet snow and avalanches is not just complicated, it's complex, and this just gives you an idea. We need to know about the snow stratigraphy, and if there's layers of sugar snow, weak cohesionless snow, if those layers are in the snowpack, that's going to result in wet snow problems sometime in the spring. Those temperatures, they're very warm and hot. As I said earlier, boy, when you hear of record temperatures, that's time to be really concerned for wet snow avalanches happening. I'd be thinking of temperature below elevations and how the first time temperatures stay above freezing overnight. At higher elevations, typically takes 2 to 3 days of above average temperatures staying above freezing to start a big wet cycle. Well, aspects that's going to happen everywhere. But really watch out, especially on the southerly aspects and on any rocky aspect where you've got rock bands, cliffs that have snow, because they're going to heat up very quickly and shed that snow. But even the northerly aspects we have to pay close attention to, especially low elevations early. But watch out for the trap of, yeah, we've got wet snow down below, I'm paying attention to it, but then we forget about dry snow instability that's happening on the higher northerly aspects as well. We're really sinking in, we've got to retreat, yeah, then that timing can happen, the instability from mid-morning to evening, or if it doesn't freeze overnight, it can persist all day. So what can we do as rescuers? This is a wet snow release, and if you look at it, remember earlier I said once it starts sliding, we don't really know how big it's going to be. Look at the upper right corner of the screen, and you can see 3 really small little wet releases. They did go to the ground, but they're really small. But this one just went a whole lot larger on the way down. And this is off-piste, or just outside the ski area in Europe, not the way they want to spend their afternoon. So what can we as rescuers do? Well, it comes down to situational awareness, and that situational awareness of everything that's going on around us. It starts by knowing the weather forecast, having an avalanche bulletin available, knowing it. If you don't have the bulletin, the weather forecast becomes even more important. Digging quick pits is really key, and not big formal pits where you're digging down, measuring all the snow layers and the hardness and the grain types and that sort of thing. What you're doing is you're looking for the wet, weak layers, or where the snow is adhering poorly. You can often do this just by reaching down with your hand if it's shallow snow or snow instability near the surface. Or a few scrapes with a shovel will get you down into where you can find those weak layers. Or even using the old ski pole test where you push it in for hardness. We do it with dry snow. We can do it for wet snow. Ideally, we like to see increasing resistance. But if you're pushing on it and then it suddenly breaks through, well, that's a sign there's weak snow underneath. Then we've got to figure out how wet is that weak snow. Gullies, couloirs, that's a favorite place to climb. It's good snow for the skiing. It's where we tend to get into trouble. Really be careful with these in periods right after snowstorms, in the first couple of days after the storm. Because the gully might face north and have cold, dry snow in it that's still not a wet snow problem, but the sides of the gully or the couloir face east and west. Those will warm up very quickly and spill wet snow down into the gully that may slide or may trigger the cold, dry snow in the gully. If you're doing a rescue with having to go get somebody from the couloir or gully and you're already seeing wet snow activity or you're fearful of it coming down, it's a really difficult position to be in. But just keep in mind that when there's been one wet releases, you can expect additional wet releases to start happening. There are times when you might have to wait until temperatures cool down, until the shadows come across and the snow starts to refreeze a bit before we can go out. Just stay off the really wet, soft snow. You're breaking into your knees, that's not the time to be out on it. Or maybe we can use explosives. The problem with explosives in wet snow is that wet snow just sucks up the energy. It attenuates the energy from explosives, and they're not always very effective. But if we need to mitigate the hazard to go in and search an area or to travel into an area, there's certainly an option. And work that out maybe with the local ski patrol or with your local law enforcement. Cornices, those big overhanging roofs of snow, when those start dripping water, that's the time to get out from underneath them. And obviously, you want to stay off cornices on top. Many famous climbers have met their end from falling through cornices or breaking off cornices, and that goes for even a number of avalanche professionals in recent years. When it comes to dry snow avalanches, I'm not real keen about using a guard in the classic sense, because dry snow avalanches move so fast, you're not going to outrun one across debris. For using a guard in dry snow, that's generally to be on the lookout for other triggers that are up above. But using a guard in wet snow is really important. Wet snow avalanches are much slower running, much better chance of getting out of the way. That also, because back to that African honeybee metaphor, they come in swarms, and once we see one, there's a good chance I shouldn't say a good chance, you will see additional wet releases. So a guard is very important in dealing with wet snow. Here's something that I don't think we think of often in mountain rescue, but have rescuers to rescue the rescuers. What's our backup plan? And this is so important because wet snow releases are often natural releases. And this would be the situation where we have someone who's badly injured, who really needs our help. It's a true life-saving condition. And I'll let you guys, you'll have to make your own determinations of what's the justifiable, defensible risk to take. Notice I didn't say acceptable risk, but what can we justify taking? But dealing with wet snow, it's a good idea to have a backup for your rescuers. And sometimes we just have to wait and wait it out until the temperatures cool and the snow gets stronger. Now there's another bullet that I could put up here that some Europeans have played with in Switzerland and Norway, and this we've learned through the ICAR meetings in recent years, but it's actually doing a short haul or a long line in of rescuers on a line, getting dropped off with enough kind of slack in the system so that they can tend to an injured person, provide some very immediate life-saving care, get them out of the snow, get them packaged enough where they can do kind of a grab and go, all while staying tied into the aircraft. So pretty novel and a neat thing that's happening. At this point, I was thinking I might be ending it, but I've got a few extra minutes, so what I'd like to do, Jess, before I throw it back to you for questions, is I want to take about 3 or 4 minutes and go through a little scenario that we've had here in Colorado. And just as we go through it, those of you that are listening, just be thinking of maybe what you might do in this situation. So Torreys Peak is one of our popular 14ers just west of Denver. Here we are, it's early May, it's a sunny and warm day. We can say this accident happened at 10 o'clock in the morning or maybe 5 o'clock in the late afternoon. There's people on the mountain at all hours on weekends. Situation, one skier swept down the east face. I'll show you a map and a location in a moment. Here's the problem. They're badly injured, as you can see, and bleeding, heavy trauma to the face, open fracture to the femur. They're responsive just verbally, but 45 minutes later, they're only responsive to real loud yelling, verbal. And it takes us on a good day of about an hour to get into where this subject would be. So what's your plan? What are you going to do? Is it a go or no go? Here's the situation. There's the east face of Torreys. The subject is about 12.8. You can see the county road that, at least the upper part, we can run snowmobiles in. It's easy to get to. It's very easy to get into that basin in the upper part with snowmobiles or by land. This is a very nice day, so it's flyable conditions as well. So if we're looking at 2 different time frames, one in the morning, it happened at 10, so realities it's probably going to be 11 when we arrive, or let's say it happened at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. So by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, this mountain is back, just getting back into shadow. By 5 o'clock, it is into shadow, but we can still sometimes see wet releases. So our concerns, we should have a list of them. Going back to those things I talked about. How sunny is it? How warm has it been? How much heat are we adding to the snow? We see natural releases. Are there other triggers? People above? What other things? And I'll just go to a quick picture here to give you an idea. That's where our subject ended up. He came down through the snowfields over a couple of the rock bands to end up there. But just to go through this, it's a sunny, warm day. It's hot. 10 o'clock in the morning, that east face is going to continue to heat up and warm for the rest of the morning and in through the afternoon. Natural triggers? Absolutely. East facing, lots of rocks and gullies, couloirs, we're going to see those. Are there other triggers, people above? Yes, as I said, it's a very popular 14er. So there's going to be many people in the area. Back to our picture, and here's another view of what this person came down. And the good news is person survived. They spent 12 weeks in the hospital and had 13 surgeries and actually walked away. Pretty darn remarkable. But here's the situation. As you look at this picture, to the looker's right, that's actually a fresh avalanche that happened sometime right around when this fellow was swept down and fell, as well as the avalanches to the left and the roller balls coming down. Those of you from Colorado that might know of this, that's Dead Dog Couloir, the dogleg couloir just to the right of the dotted line. So again, we've got to be thinking about all of these things, whether we go or we don't go. 10 o'clock in the morning, it's sunny and hot. We are going to see natural releases. There's going to be people above. Maybe in this situation, you might want to get somebody flown to the summit first so you can keep people back and not looking out onto the face or going or starting to ski down. The report is coming in from the RPs saying this person's condition is deteriorating, their consciousness is decreasing, they're bleeding worse. There's that real urgency. This could be a true life-saving action. And it was. It happened a little bit later in the morning. But at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, I would want to keep those other triggers, other people out away before going in, have other rescuers as a backup plan. And as you would look at this where the person ended up, you may be able to run in, grab the person, slide them, pull them, drag them to the looker's left under the big rock buttress that actually offers some protection and where you can stabilize and then transport. At 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening, it's now in shadow. The snow's cooling off. Not as many people up there. Now it's a much easier decision to go in and help somebody. So timing situation, I mean, every accident is different, and we all know that from mountain rescue. But if you're making that decision to go, don't take it as just an acceptable risk. It has to be a defensible risk. Can you defend your decisions? And do that by having a good system. So with that, that's the end of my talk. I'd like to thank everybody for sitting in. I'll turn it back to you, Jess, and let's see what we have for questions.
All right. Thank you, Dale, for that. And if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat/questions section of your control panel. And we don't have any yet, so I'll just give you guys a few minutes to do that. And while you're doing that, I'll just kind of go over maybe a little bit of extra stuff. You'll see links on the end page when I do the wrap-up, but the presentation was recorded, like I said at the beginning, and so you can see the recording of this presentation on the PMI and MRA websites, and you can also access the previous webinars that are in this series on both of those websites. Okay, so the first question that we have is it possible to knock the feet out from under a wet avalanche?
To knock the feet out from under a wet avalanche, not like we see with dry snow avalanches. Dry snow avalanches with significant weak layers, you get a collapse at the bottom, and it's very much like pulling the log out of the bottom of the wood pile. and it can come down on top. With wet snow avalanches, it's much less likely to, it's not going to happen. The fractures tend not to propagate through wet snow. But what can happen is you can be low on a slope that still has some pitch to it. It collapses locally right around you, and if it is steep enough, it will start sliding. And wet snow doesn't have to be as steep as dry snow to avalanche. So the short answer, sorry for the long answer, the short answer is you're not going to collapse the snow at the bottom of a steep slope and then have fractures go up the mountain and then come down on top of you. But do watch out for collapsing something down low, but that still has a good pitch to it, like 20, 25 degrees, 20 degrees. That could still carry you down.
Okay. The next question is there an approximate minimal angle of release for wet slides versus dry slides?
Oh, with dry snow, the magic number is right around 38 degrees. With wet snow, it still runs right around 30, but it can go much less than that. I think we would probably see the number be much less, but there's not many people out taking the slope angles. People have been killed in wet snow avalanches that occurred on slopes that were just a little over 15 degrees. It's happened in Japan. It happened, the bed surface was bamboo, so it's basically grass, slippery grass. So there isn't a good answer. For anybody from Alaska or people that are going into the Arctic, there's something called slush flow avalanches. And this is where the snow gets super saturated because the sun angles are high, the days are warming very fast in April. The ground is frozen, so there's nowhere for that water to go. Maybe it gets clogged up, so to speak. The snow gets very saturated and wet, and we can see slush flow avalanches on slopes of 5 degrees. And these things will run just everywhere. It's just like knocking the Slurpee over at the counter at the 7-Eleven. And these are a bigger problem in Norway because they tend to have people traveling in the Arctic during these periods.
Okay. The next question is it's a little bit long, so bear with me. Back on the how wet is wet slide, there's a line representing the strength versus water content that drastically decreases at about 7%. Other than drastic, can you quantify how much weaker the snow gets at that moisture content level, and then 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, etc.?
Let me just pull that back up here. Yeah, let me draw the line in. It can be quantified in the lab, and I actually have to go back to a couple of papers to look at it. But the loss of strength is on an order of magnitude. It's a tremendous loss of strength in just literally a 1 to 2% change in liquid water content. So the short answer is it's very significant. And I think from a practitioner's standpoint, when we go from snow that we can make a good snowball to snow that we can squeeze water out, it drips out while we make the snowball, at that point, that's the time to stay off of those slopes because the snow is now, it has lost, it's basically lost most of its strength.
Okay. When rescuers are committed to scene working stabilization and packaging of a rescue subject, natural wet releases occur around the site. So what are some actions to mitigate the danger to the evacuation team?
Sure, to mitigate the danger to the evacuation team, this is always easier said than done, but one is to try and limit exposure. Fewer people, better with it. Watch out, or let's restate that. Don't stay in any sort of gully, or I mean, like runnel or channel in the snow. We saw one of the very first slides that I showed that said, "Don't be those guys." It was a very dramatic gully in the channel in the snow. So it may be moving up to a high point of that. Trying to use rocks above you to act as some sort of deflection can help as well. And the last thing is to limit your time. Do it as quickly as you can. In wet snow instability, it may very well be the period of kind of the grab and go. Grab, move, then to grab, go to an area that you feel more confident that is less risky to really fine-tune your packaging. But you don't want to stay on site with a patient in wet snow instability for any length of time, because I think all of us know when you're packaging a patient, it always takes much longer than we think it will.
Okay, and that looks like all of the questions so far. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. If you do have any further questions, you can get them in real quick as we close. Let me switch over to my screen here. If you have further questions, or you're watching this at a later date, you can email Dale at his email address shown on the screen. Let me see if I can get it to go ahead. There we go. All right, and the MRA webinar series hosts webinars frequently, so you can keep an eye on the MRA and PMI websites and email blast the MRA email lister for future dates and topics. The MRA and PMI websites listed there are where you will find the recording of this webinar. And for news and updates, you can follow the MRA and PMI on Facebook and Twitter at the addresses shown on your screen. And we want to thank everybody for attending. I hope that it was helpful, and thanks again, Dale, for presenting it.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great day, everybody.